Our next speaker, we're having to do a bit of reshuffle today. Just did a TED talk about 3 weeks ago. Just got back from Australia somewhere in February, March, where he was invited to do a talk as well. So we're actually quite fortunate to have Alex with us. Alex, yeah, you take it away, mate.
Hey, thank you so much. I'm hearing myself as I speak. I don't know if that's meant to be the case.
You're coming through loud and clear on the side.
All right. Yeah, so I'll quickly give you a brief outline of who I am and what I do, especially because I guess I'm somewhat unexpected. So my name is Alfi. I'm a product designer, and I work in the smart tech space at the moment. But really where my heart lies is in the topic of this talk. And it's about, in some ways, it's about mentorship, but in other ways, it's also about my own personal story and how we can think about learning and education in each of our own professional environments. I initially started this talk in the tech space, but it's gotten much broader than that. And so I'm excited for you to hear a little bit about it. So, as was mentioned, a talk I gave quite recently was published, and it was on the idea of self-directed learning. And really, there was one main question I was looking to understand and to address as we explored this. And it was this. This was a central question. In a world where technological advancements are changing at such a rapid rate, and I mean, you can see it in your own industry, you can see it in many other industries, and some as simple as farming to some as complex as, entrepreneurship and starting businesses. But the question I wanted to focus on is, in that world, how can knowledge specifically be most effectively passed down from one generation to the next? If we think about the context of healthcare, there's some parts of the world where it's so advanced, and so much so that it can seem a little bit like sci-fi. And then there are other areas in 2023 right now that are so far behind that it's hard to believe. And so the question is, how do we actually start to disseminate that knowledge and start to create some level of equilibrium, especially so that those in the less fortunate domains can actually start to access more of the more cutting edge knowledge. And so I'll run a little bit quickly through some of the ideas that I spoke about in that talk, and then I'll address the question which I didn't get to address in that talk, and that is, what do we actually do about this change and this opportunity? But so where the conversation started was in this idea of this three-pronged representation of a curriculum or a learning system. You typically have the learning material, the learning method, and the educator. And whether it's a primary school environment, high school, university, or eventually the professional environment and research, you see the same thing with managers and direct reports. And so this is a pattern that we see in all parts of life. And so I looked at exploring it, but specifically through the lens of technological advancements that have allowed each of these domains to take a step forward. And so the first was around the idea of the learning material. And so we walked through this idea of adaptive learning. And so there's a great psychologist, Lev Vygotsky, who introduced this idea of the zone of proximal development. And it's specifically relevant because it aims to map out how we actually learn and how we gain new skills in the context of a world where we could be in danger or, in a sense, be a predator on the other hand. And so in this idea, he looks to explore three key domains. The idea of mastered knowledge, the things that you know how to do, and the things that don't necessarily require your intelligence and your focus to achieve. And then there's this much wider domain of things that you can't do even with help. And then he talks about this idea of ideal learning, this middle ground in between those two zones, where with a little bit of stretching, with a little bit of expanding and sort of taking a risk out into the unknown, You can learn new things and develop new capabilities. And the last element that he adds to this map is the idea of the more knowledgeable other. And this is what an educator does in the learning process. It's somebody who is more capable in this domain, who knows more, and also is able to engage with the learner to expand the zone that is safe to explore. And so what might have simply been this thin area of ideal learning can be expanded through the relationship with a more knowledgeable other. And so by this, we get to see that there's a way that we can think about the learning material we use in learning relationships that focuses on material that's right outside their mastered knowledge, but still safe to explore. And as mentors, as managers, as heads of departments, this is one of the things we really need to focus on to have long-term positive growth within the team that you're responsible for. And that sort of looks at the first element of this triad. And the second is that of the actual learning method. I think this is one that a lot of people can intuitively talk about and sense, but haven't clearly crystallized what the problems are. And so what I was aiming to do is uncover some kind of method that's agnostic to a person's innate abilities. And why this was specifically relevant to my own experience is because I'm dyslexic. And so going through school, I always struggled a lot more than was immediately necessary, simply because reading wasn't an ideal methodology for me. And so once I eventually dropped out of university and started working, that curiosity that was never sort of ignited in the schooling environment started to be engaged by things like long form video and audiobooks and other formats that favor my own forms of learning. And so what I aimed to do to find this agnostic methodology was to look at different learning relationships that have existed across human development. And I simply chose three, simply because they represent three types of learning. And the first is that of the parent-child relationship. This goes back, obviously, long before humans even were around, because species before us still had these developmental relationships, although in maybe a little bit more primitive or different form. But one of the things that's consistent is that there's this idea that the parent is teaching a child, but it isn't sort of a didactic form of teaching. It isn't a lecture or anything like that. Instead, it's sort of like being together in the speech, in the carrying of them, if in the baby talk and all of that. They grow through the sensory experience. And so it's almost like an idea of learning by being. And then if you look, if you fast forward through human development, one of the really big leaps forward was the Industrial Revolution. And around that time, right before the Industrial Revolution, the economies were built on craft masters and guilds. And so skills were passed down from a craft specialist, be it a blacksmith, a cobbler, a farmer, a weaver, whatever it might be. They pass the skills down, but not in the professional environment. Because one of the interesting things about guilds in the Middle Ages is that when you take on apprentice, they would actually join your household, and it would be a 7-year process. And so it's almost like the methodology, again, is not didactic. It's not lectures. It's by being a part of the professional process and being a part of the production, you learn by being around that more knowledgeable other, both in how they work their craft, but also in how they live. And that's why that you would join their household. And then with the Industrial Revolution, the need for craft specialists sort of dropped. And so instead, what society with a capital S, I guess, needed was a large-scale method, a way that you don't necessarily need to come out with a specialist, but you do need to come out with a lot of semi-specialized people, and then the machines do the rest. Now, the problem with that is that's only an ideal method when machines can output what you need. But as technology has advanced and some of the things that are required of our economies are starting to become specializations again, And some of the older ones even have moved across, like medicine, and new ones have emerged, like technology and software development. And again, we're needing these specialized skills, but our learning methodology doesn't actually allow for that, because it's become focused on creating semi-skilled people rather than craft specialists. And the interesting thing is, when you look at society right now, we still have parental mentorship relationships. We still have that in our society, and we still have this class-based method of learning that's based on listening and writing and memorization. But with the Industrial Revolution, the idea of craft specialists sort of dissolved into society, and these new domains don't have established professional mentorship relationships. And so this is where I'd really like to focus, and this is where I left off in the last iteration of this talk. And so I'd like to focus specifically on this idea of mentorship, because I think in a world where technology is advancing and making knowledge openly accessible, the place that we need to now focus is on the relationship between the learner and the educator. Because it's no longer the case that the focus is the library and making sure that everybody has books, because the internet is very quickly making that a non-issue anymore. And so we can spend more time harnessing the relationship between the educator and the learner. And so this is a third and final element that we need to address. How do we make the relationship with the educator an openly accessible thing? And one of the things we know about industries like education and even like healthcare is that relationships that require, professions that require one-on-one relationships are extremely difficult to scale, while things like STEM and technology tend to scale a little bit easier. And so what I'd like to do is explore some of the ways that we can actually achieve this. And so there are sort of three ways that I've sort of found when I went back to look at how we might be able to address this. And so the first one comes from what some of my research into the Middle Ages and the guilds and apprenticeship structure. And that's the idea of actually reintroducing apprenticeships. And, they somewhat exist still unofficially in many disciplines. But I think by systemizing it and bolstering that process, we can make the process of transitioning from being a student to being a professional a little bit easier. And then another one that I looked at is an exchange program. What that looked like around the time of guilds and apprenticeship was a journeymanship. And that's where a craft person would have finished their apprenticeship, but not yet be a craft master. And so they'd go out on a journey to another land where there are the same craft discipline, and they would study under that person, and then eventually come back home and bring back knowledge from other lands. And that's how knowledge essentially would get disseminated. And so what I've been exploring is how we can reintroduce this, possibly in a way where professionals can move actually into different companies and understand how different organizations, be it hospitals, be it service providers, be it technology companies, simply move across them so that the knowledge can actually spread among the entire industry faster. The one that I won't go too far into is multidisciplinary teams. This is where my research at the moment is really focused, because I think this is the step that allows us to start to really leverage entrepreneurship for economic and positive growth in societies. The one that I'd like to explore in a little bit more detail with you is this idea of peer-to-peer mentorship. And the reason for that is because it's the one that's specifically geared to enabling scale. You see, what you very quickly realize with the typical education environment is that the thing that's always hardest to manage is the time of the teachers, because children have a lot of needs. And if you think about the typical sort of classroom environment, it's almost impossible for a teacher to give every single child all the things that they need. But that's a problem that even goes into the professional environment. Managers, especially when they have a lot of direct reports, face the exact same issue. But the interesting thing about peer mentorship is it allows two learners to build a relationship that creates growth in both without necessarily requiring a person that's much older and much more skilled in the field. And so, when I initially started looking into the domain of mentorship and exploring the landscape, you kind of have this strange or somewhat idyllic idea of what mentorship looks like. You'll be this person who, let's say you've got a mentor. There are these things that you're good at, the things that you love, things that you get paid for, the things that you're passionate about in the world. And you're gonna have this Yoda type person who will sort of swoop in and give you the perfect advice that you need at the exact right moment. And that's how you'll, live happily ever after. And then around sometime last year, I started speaking with a very interesting lady. Her name is Abby Covert, and she's one of the world's leading information architects or thinkers in the space of information architecture. And it seemed like we both had this interest in mentorship, and so we've been exploring the idea together. And the three main challenges we found in how we conceptualize mentorship today, or our generally our growth focused relationships. And the first is the idea of out of context mentorship, and it's one of the ones that I'll dive into a little bit. But then there's also the idea of the imbalance of agency, or the fact that when you have a teacher and a student typically, or you have a manager and a mentor, a manager and a direct report, there isn't necessarily the ideal amount of autonomy for that learner. And in their amazing book, The Self-Driven Child, Ned Johnson and William Stixrud explore how internal motivation is relevant specifically in the growth of a child, and how agency is central to actually engaging internal motivation. And the last is the idea of the over-leveraged mentor. And I think a lot of us have kind of seen this. And it's the case where, this great manager simply has too many people to engage with. And so they're not able to effectively mentor each one of the people that they have as their reports. And so everybody gets a bad experience instead of a few people getting a good experience. But one of the ways I'd like to illustrate how we can actually resolve this problem is using the idea of the 4 stages of knowledge. And it's an idea that breaks down how people, or the different categories people experience as they are becoming more competent in a specific subject. And we all, from the beginning, start from this place of unconscious incompetence. We don't even know what we don't know. It's kind of just like an ephemeral lack of knowledge. And then eventually we start to become consciously competent. Maybe, we experiment a little bit, we try it out a little bit. And we start to see, oh, these are all the things that I don't know how to do yet. And if I want to be competent, I'll need to learn each one of them. And then you start to do that. And as you go through this process, eventually you slowly become consciously competent, and you know all the things that you know, but you also know the things you had to learn to get to where you are. And then eventually, when you've been doing something for so long, it eventually becomes, the saying goes, like riding a bike. It becomes unconsciously competent. You know how to do it, but you can't exactly put it into words because you've been doing it for so long. Things like breathing, things like walking, the things that sort of escape your consciousness. And, if you think about how out of context mentorship presents itself, you might have this mentor who is capable in these, let's say, 7 fields. And they're very knowledgeable and they understand a lot. And you would think, okay, this is a person who'd be a great mentor in each one of these spaces. But here's the interesting thing that happens. When you've got a person who is in the unconsciously incompetent space and a person that's unconsciously competent, they aren't actually able to effectively engage with each other because the incompetent person doesn't know what they don't know. And the competent person has been doing it for so long that they can't explain how they do it. And so that's and one of the examples of this is why a lot of parents will find that a tutor that's slightly older than their child is a better tutor than the parent actually tutoring the child. And that's because the older student has been through those classes a lot more recently. And so they can actually walk through the experience that they went through. And so what happens when people are too fast spread across the competence um, matrix is that things that they are capable of doing, they're not capable of being a mentor in. And so how we can address this is focusing instead on changing the way the mentor engages with them and focusing in this area that's outside of their capability. If we map back to the zone of proximal development, you simply focus on creating safety. You don't necessarily tell them what to learn. You don't necessarily tell them what to do. In this space, what you want to do is allow them to feel safe. And then in this area of ideal growth, in this zone of proximal development, you want that safety to allow them to step out and try things that they might fail at, because that's where the learning happens. And this is really where the place of psychological safety comes in. But then in the things that they're capable of doing, it's no longer about psychological safety, and it's also not even that much about gaining new skills. Instead, what a mentor can do is encourage the other person to be a mentor. And this is where the network effect starts to happen. Because we start to allow mentors to mentor other mentors, and those mentors to mentor other people in the skills that they are capable in. And so we still are at the challenge of actually scaling the mentorship, because even though there is this network effect, we need to look at what does the actual growth relationship look like. And so I did some exploration into some Eastern thinking, specifically the IKIGAI. And the IKIGAI focuses specifically on the four outer quadrants of this Venn diagram. And the Venn diagram was eventually developed a little bit later on. But what the Ikigai speaks about is the idea of what makes a meaningful life or a life worth living. And it's these four categories: the things you love, the things that you are good at, the ways that you serve, and the things that you believe the world needs. If your professional life and your life as a whole focuses on addressing each one of these categories, they posit that that is what a fulfilling life specifically for you would look like. And so I started to think a little bit in conversation with Abby, like what might peer mentorship actually look like, taking this definition of a meaningful life as an axiom or as a assumed foundation. And so we start to see that two of these quadrants speak a little bit about what I can do for the world, while two of them speak about what I might be able to get from it. And so if we build a learning relationship of two people at equal levels, we might actually be able to create the growth found in the zone of proximal development because of the diversity, instead of because of the fact that one person is more knowledgeable. Because I am good at some stuff and you are good at other things, there's opportunity for both of us to be learning, but there's also opportunity for both of us to be mentoring. And so we've been in conversation specifically about what that might look like. And taking this Venn diagram even further, although we may be stepping partly away from the original idea of the Ikigai, one of the things that I'm finding is that it's allowing us to look at specific parts of life that are usually so abstract that they're difficult to put into words. But by using this diagram and using this process, it gives you a clear structure of how to actually step through this process with another person in a one-on-one dialogue. And I believe by doing that, what we can start to do is changing the way we think about a curriculum. Changing the way we think about knowledge is the way knowledge is distributed. And so I think through peer mentorship, we can achieve something very interesting. And so to end off, I'd like you to take a deep breath. And imagine. Imagine you're standing in the city center. A sea of faces hang on your every word. And as you look out over the city center of Athens, over the youthful faces that you have dedicated your entire life to growing, suddenly somebody stands up, an old enemy of yours, and they accuse you of the most heinous crime, corrupting the youth of Athens. And that might seem somewhat trivial for us today, but around that time, that was a crime punishable by death. And so as you think back on your life, in your final moments, you have not succumbed to cowardice. You have not allowed them to tarnish your name. And you will take the poison that they place before you. Because you know that the work that you and your mentee, Plato, have put an indelible mark on the growth of humanity. For Socratic dialogue would become the foundational concept of the pedagogical process in Western society. And as you think back on those last days, you hope that one day this story is a story that can be repeated across the world. And so I believe with this idea of shared learning, we have the opportunity to step into a brighter future. Thank you. All right. I guess that would be back to you, Theo. Oh, well, I mean, in the meantime, I think I still have a couple of minutes, so I'm happy to answer any questions. If anyone has any thoughts, if you'd like me to go back to a slide, happy to expand on anything.
Alfi, I don't know if you can hear me.
Yeah, I can hear you.
Very good. Thanks for that, man. Really appreciate it. Love this. I did a quick poll. I just wanted to find out in the audience. I think 2 people sort of voted on that the current position they have, their mentors, which I think is great. Just one question that sort of popped up, especially on my side. I mean, how do you choose the correct mentor for you? I mean, obviously, it's more of a process. So, what's your thoughts on that?
Yeah, no, that's a very good question, and it's one of the reasons why I started this process with using something like the idea of the IKIGAI, starting specifically with something reflective. Asking yourself the question like, what are the things that you love to do? What are the things that if you got them, it would be worth a lot of effort and a lot of learning and a lot of time investment? And if you start there, then it gives you a place to also start looking for a mentor. Look for other people who love doing what you love. Look for other people who believe in what you believe in. And also when you do that, you also don't have to go through the typical process of, going to a person and saying, will you be my mentor? Because it's always a little bit difficult as a person to say, okay, yes, I'll be a mentor, because it's not clear whether the person's asking you to help them raise their kids or just help them figure out how to study for a test. But if you've gone through this reflective process already, you've already got the material to have that conversation. And so you can also use that to vet who might be a good mentor for you. And so I think that's how you can kind of get started with that process. But then also what it enables is that you can also have different mentors. Maybe you can have one mentor that loves the same thing that you love, but a different mentor who maybe believes the same thing you believe. And I mean, that's the case for me. I've got this very good friend who I've built a peer mentorship relationship with, and especially because of my Kenyan heritage, I love my red meat, and she's probably about as vegan as it gets, and we'll never really agree on that. But there are some things about the world that we really, really align on. And those are the things that we focus on engaging about. And, maybe we educate each other a little bit about the things that we don't agree about. And so, you can really start to think about what are the best types of mentorship relationships you can build.
Great stuff. Thank you for that. So we have Lily Parsons, and she's got a question on any specific ways we could implement this in the workplace.
So they are, and I think that's where the focus of my work is right now. When I come to platforms like this, I try not to sell too much, and I instead like to speak a little bit more about the ideas. But I think that's really where my focus is, putting together a guide of how to actually put this into our daily lives. I think two things that I could say that you could start with that typically are very effective, but does require one evangelist to kind of put on their hand, is I think a book club is always a good starting place, because it gives you material that's maybe not personal to start the growth relationship with. And it's something also that's easy to sell to internal stakeholders. Starting a book club is always good for the company that you work at, because it means everybody's getting a little bit better at something that's relevant to the company. But then you don't stop at simply doing the book club. You pair people up in that book club, and they can actually start going in these one-on-one engagements about the book. And then the book club is kind of just where everybody comes together and talks about what they've done and what they're interested in. The other thing that I'd also say that's useful is your onboarding process. That's a very good place where you can almost Trojan horse mentorship in. Every time you hire a new person into your team and they join in, they go through a micro curriculum. We don't think about it like that, but they have to learn where the toilet is. They have to learn, where they apply for leave. Like, there are all these things that they need to do, and so there is a growth process that needs to happen. And what you can do is you can leverage that as an opportunity to start building relationship in existing employees. You make them responsible for the onboarding process of this person rather than a manager. And they start to pick up the skills that a manager would typically do, but it's in a way that's so low risk that they can actually learn. And so you can use these as entry points to start peer mentorship. And then I'd also say there are a lot of resources online about how to run your peer mentorship, and a lot of books in that space. Two good ones, one in tech and one in design. The Manager's Path is a good one, because it speaks about different forms of mentorship and different typologies. And then the other good one is The Making of a Manager, and it's by I think she was a college graduate, and then went to work at Facebook as a designer, and then became one of the first, managers in the not one of the first, but in their first generation of managers at Facebook. And so she writes a reflection on how she actually went from being an individual contributor to being a manager, and the skill that she picked up along the way. So that's another great book that you can use to kind of like pull out some guidelines on how to do that from a practical perspective.
Great point. Thank you for that. Just one long question from myself. So I'm sure there's some people that's sort of watching now that's kind of been thrusted into the whole sort of mentorship position, whether it being at your work or the community that you're in. And sometimes we're faced with a situation that your mentee just doesn't listen. Just like, hey, listen, if you just sort of follow my advice, is there something as a mentor you need to change within yourself, or is it something you need to address with your mentee? Where's that sweet spot that you don't sort of offend people, for a better word?
Sorry, you sort of cut out a little bit in the part where you're speaking about about advice. Can you just repeat that bit a little bit again?
Sorry, you're breaking up as well. Yeah, so if you get thrusted into this at your workplace where you become a mentor and your mentee just doesn't listen, like what sort of advice can you give?
Okay. I think when a person doesn't listen, it's very easy to interpret it as the fact that either they're unwilling to listen, or that's usually probably what we assume. But I think sometimes the problem is that they cannot do what you're asking them to do, or they actually don't know what you're asking. They may understand what you've said, but don't know how that actually maps to their own behavior. And so I'd say when a person isn't listening, it's usually a signal that there's a lack of clarity, like there's a meeting of minds that's yet to happen. And so what I would say is, when a person isn't listening, you can almost use that map of the zone of proximal development, things you know how to do, the things that are ideal for learning, and the things outside of your capability. If a person isn't listening, try to first identify like which zones does it fit in, because you want to behave differently in each. If a person is not listening because it's outside of their zone of capabilities, you don't want to be stern and give them the wagging of the finger. But if it's something that you're asking them to do that's within their ideal learning space, then it's something that you need to clearly clarify, because it might be that they don't understand something. While if it's something they're capable of doing, then it's actually not a matter of capacity. It's probably a matter of whether they think it's a worthwhile thing to do or the right thing to do. And so I think when a person isn't listening, it's usually an invitation to explore what the underlying challenge is. Now, sometimes it's simply because a person is, quote unquote, misbehaving. And sometimes, and I think, that's not always as bad of a thing as it is, because sometimes people misbehave a little bit because they want to see, like, what are the boundaries, especially if the boundaries aren't clearly communicated. The way that they eventually get established is by people pushing the boundaries. And then eventually, as the mentor or as the manager, you establish where that boundary is. And so I think sometimes, when a person isn't listening, it can even be an opportunity to establish where those boundaries are and make that clear without necessarily having to, punish the person or whatever it might be immediately. But I think then the next time around, once that's been made clear, then it might be that they want to see, like, when you set a boundary, do you mean it, or are you just talking? And so when they try it again, it is now the time to sort of reinforce that boundary and make it clear that this is where the line is drawn. So I think, you really need to think beyond the fact that they're not listening and try to understand the underlying reasoning, and then move forward from there.
Okay. Perfect. Thank you so much for that, Alfi. I really appreciate your time.
All right.
That was a really good talk. And thank you for everyone for joining. Thank you again, Alf.
My pleasure. Cheers.